So, let's need to start our session number 2. Afternoon. First speaker is Professor Hughes from United States, professor of philosophy and St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. Chip is author of many books. He's a great scholar, but also a poet. He has written really very impressive poems, elegies, and he is a great expert in the field of literature and something in between philosophy and arts, but also I convinced human rights law and many things, and we know each other from Eric Figuring Society for years, so I'm very glad that
20 years.
20 years that you are here, and it is part of the same gang, and Chip, what is yours?
Thank you. Thank you, Martin, for arranging us, and Ilona for the house, and all of you for being here. I'm going to begin by thanking you for a couple of things. You brought up at the very beginning of your talk the fact that many of the most important human rights documents since the war, since the Second World War, have articulated that human rights are founded on the principle of dignity. And happily, for me, you didn't go on about that because that's what I'm talking about. But you introduced it, which is very good. You also mentioned that there is this introduction of the principle of human dignity in constitutions and covenants, in declarations and articles, especially in state constitutions, have created all kinds of problems for the legal world, the legal and jurisprudential world. What are we talking about when we talk about dignity? And which reminded me of a quote. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. There's a very long 2009 piece by Christopher McCrudden on dignity as in legal and jurisprudential circles. And I happen to have a quote of his with me where he says, "So far at least there is little evidence that the legal and judicial use of the concept of inherent dignity, human dignity, has been directly affected by recent philosophical political theory analysis or vice versa." This is a problem. This is so you'll be glad to know I'm not discussing the legal context, but rather the philosophical context. I have a lot of thoughts about the legal context, but that's I'll leave that to you. Thank God. Let me begin with two quick sort of apologies. One is that whereas Martin and even more Yuri were addressing concrete, specific cases and political context and circumstances, I will be doing something different than that. I'm going to be focusing upon the issue, one of the issues in our invitation letter, pertaining to the moral and spiritual bases of authority of human rights documents, and in line with Václav Havel's comments about the experience of the absolute in particular as a basis for the universal promulgation of human rights. And in order to do that, there's a kind of meditative, reflective nature to what I'm going to present, which is a little less dramatically interesting. And it's a terrible thing to do to you after lunch at 2 o'clock to ask you to participate with me in a kind of meditative reflection. But that's the timing. That's how it is. The other thing I'm going to do that I have to apologize for is that unlike Martin and Yuri, I'm going to be mainly reading and then commenting a little bit on what I'm reading rather than extemporizing as much. But I'll make, it's okay, it'll be juicy. So the last thing to say is that I'm not a Patočka scholar, but I have been immersing myself in the heretical essays in the philosophy of history for some time now. And that's where I'm going in my paper, is to the application of some of Patočka's ideas and vision with respect to what I just mentioned, Havel's concept of the experience of the absolute. So, with those introductory comments, what I ended up doing was writing a paper that was too long to present, so I'm going to be summarizing some of the philosophical expository bits in it, and then reading the parts of it that are basic to my thesis, to what I want to explore, and also the material pertaining to young Patočka and comments by Václav Havel. So in a speech, Václav Havel's speech of 1995, in which he was part of the series of speakers for the opening of the Strasbourg European Court of Human Rights, he said that he noted that for the Czechoslovakian dissidents of the 1970s and 80s, the starting point for their endeavors was the concept of respect for human rights as laid down in various international conventions. And in fact, the Manifesto of Charter 77, of which both Havel and, of course, Jan Patočka were key signatories and spokespersons, begins by citing what you already mentioned, the United Nations' International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. That's how it starts. These are two covenants that were formally, in fact, adopted into Czechoslovakia's legal framework in 1976. The Manifesto of Charter 77 begins by citing them and mentioning that legal incorporation before developing its indictment of the Republic's failure to honor basic human rights through careful and specific mention of rights articulated in those two documents. And I think the power of, part of the power of Charter 77 is the embrace of those documents as a moral foundation for their demand that the state obey its duty to provide its citizens with what the Charter describes as those features of a civilized life for which forces of progress have striven throughout history. That's the language of Charter 77. Now, one of the most significant features of both of those covenants is the assertion in their preambles that the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. And this is an assertion that serves a lot of purposes, but its main purpose is to answer a critical question. What is the basis for claiming that human beings have rights? Many people aren't willing to ask that question, but it's a question that has to be asked. And Havel asked it, of course. It's an assertion that makes clear that rights do not derive from any kind of external recognition, any kind of external authority. Human beings, it declares or implies, are endowed with rights not because of some social contract, not any kind of social contract. Human rights are, as the document presents them, permanent, they're universal, they're equal, and they are, to use this loaded word, inalienable. Inalienable. That is, they're part of, to use philosophical language, they're part of the ontological constitution of every human being. Because their basis lies in the fact and in the structure of human existence itself. It's, therefore, the documents refer to them as rights that are founded in an inherent human dignity. And what human dignity is the special worth or the special value of human beings deriving from distinctive qualities belonging to human nature. And that's the foundation of rights because those distinctive qualities require specific opportunities, specific freedoms, specific protections in order to realize themselves. I'll get to the issue of responsibility as well. So civic and political and economic and social and cultural rights are presented in the documents as requisite conditions for the free and full development of human personality as ontologically given. So, this understanding of inherent dignity and this use of it as a foundational principle informs the Ur document of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. from 1948. And it's very clearly expressed in many of the charters and conventions and constitutions that have appeared during the last half century. Not all of them specify inherent dignity as the foundation of rights, but many of them do. And in fact, sometime in the 1980s, I believe, the United Nations introduced a directive that further declarations of new areas of rights were to include this derivative principle of founding on human dignity. Now, it's notable that in every one of these documents, we find the principle of inherent human dignity presented simply as a fact, a stark fact, without further definition of what that dignity is, and certainly without any elaboration of its metaphysical basis or origin or source. And that absence of definition and that absence of identification of metaphysical context or source obviously serves a very important political function. Human rights instruments have to strive to appeal and be convincing to governments and institutional leaders and persons of every worldview, and whether secular or religious. And if these documents were to specify any metaphysical source or any religious source of inherent human dignity, or to define the essence of human dignity in a way that's too culturally specific, then the effective appeal of the documents would be restricted and their universality would be somewhat undermined. However, inevitably, this absence of any account of the metaphysical source of human dignity or any substantive definition of exactly what it is has rendered the concept vulnerable to all kinds of criticisms. These come from the world of legal scholars. Legal scholars and philosophers of various stripes have dismissed this stark concept of inherent dignity as empty rhetoric, empty speech, means nothing, especially if no source of it is identified. Then on the other hand, you have religious spokespersons and groups who say this is simply a pointless secular Western concept because it does not specify the God-givenness of the basis of human dignity. So there's all kinds of vulnerabilities that are presented by the fact that it's given in a non-contextualized form and just stated as a founding principle in the documents. On the other hand, it's been very well argued by many people that this vulnerability is more than compensated for by two strong advantages in affirming, without contextualization, the principle of inherent dignity. The first one is the one I've already referred to. It's the principle's very non-contextualization that guards its capacity to serve as a symbolic evocation of the intrinsic worth of every human being in a transcultural way, and so to perform a crucial political role in articulating a universal and existentially intrinsic foundation of human rights. It can speak to Eastern cultures, Chinese cultures, Southeast Asian cultures, African cultures, European cultures, because it doesn't have that baggage, if you want to use that term. Second, though, the very declaration that all human beings share an inherent dignity, which being inherent makes it thus inalienable, or to use another word that's often used, inviolable, which is the word that's used at the beginning of the Grundgesetz, the Basic Law of Federal Republic of Germany from 1949. That affirmation of inherency and inalienability carries philosophical implications that, when carefully considered, reveal themselves to be quite far-reaching. The most important of them, I think, is this. Attaching the concept of inherency to the notion of human dignity points to, and I'm going to use a controversial word here, points to a transcendent source of our moral obligation to respect the rights and the basic dignity of persons. The main purpose of my paper is to provide some philosophical exploration and explanation, clarification regarding this inferential link between the notion of inherent dignity and a necessarily transcendent source of that dignity. And that's an aim that I believe is fully in harmony with the philosophical orientations and the spiritual legacies of both Václav Havel and Jan Patočka. But it will need some elaboration. So, what I do, I'm going to summarize now the next, 8 pages or so of my paper. What I do in the paper is I engage in 2 preliminary clarifications. One of them, first of all, I spell out some of the essential ideas that belong to the concept of inherent dignity in the way that the documents don't do. Because it's necessary philosophically to explore this, to explain a little bit what is meant exactly by describing or ascribing a special and distinctive value to the human person. I have quite a number of colleagues who would have a little trouble with that notion by itself. So I do this by considering the notions of personhood and freedom, hardly a novel approach. But I end up identifying 5 elements that make up what I call the core constellation of meanings in the concept of human dignity. And here's what they are. Here's what the 5 elements are. First, there's, I'm still going to use, it's somewhat of an old-fashioned word, and I have to go back before the Enlightenment meaning of it, but the word reason, the ability of the human beings to inquire, to understand, to know, to evaluate, to judge, to decide, and so forth. All of that encapsulated in the notion of reason. Secondly, there's human freedom. Third, there's responsibility, which is the flip side of freedom. Fourth, there is the irreplaceability or the uniqueness of every human person. And fifthly, there is the vulnerability of every person to suffering and degradation. And if you hold those 5 elements in mind, reason, reasoning, freedom, responsibility, irreplaceability, and vulnerability to suffering, I think you have a fairly non-controversial constellation of basic meanings that are carried by this notion of dignity. Second, I explain that the assertion that every person possesses an inherent dignity means that this is an ontological state or quality that is genuinely not alienable, not violable, and therefore it is dependent neither on its recognition by other people or ourselves, nor is it dependent upon your or my achievement of living a dignified life, what we would consider an admirable, virtuous life. It's not dependent on either of those things. We can distinguish between inherent or basic dignity, as it's often called, by Hughes and other people, and achieved dignity. There's the essential inherent dignity which cannot be taken away. And then there's the existentially lived, achieved dignity of somebody that we say, ah yes, this person is living a dignified life. Those have to be distinguished quite carefully. And I go into some detail regarding the fact that inherent dignity cannot be erased by misdeeds or by victimization or by self-hatred or self-destructiveness or despair. It can't be destroyed by anything. And in fact, it's something that you can't strive for and that you don't need to strive for. It's given with your humanness. It is an indestructible, basic human truth given along with every living human being. That's what the meaning of the documents, the meaning of saying that it's inherent. Also, that leads to the point that a notion of inherent human dignity, on which all these human rights, crucial human rights documents are based, cannot be properly understood as based on the exercise or the ability to exercise certain capacities. This is a little bit of a tricky point. It can't be understood to depend upon the specific stage or functional efficiency of a human being's moral capacities, mental capacities, physical capacities. And it's that independence of that, it's that independence from those contexts that ensures our respect for the basic dignity of, for example, newborns and infants, and the severely mentally retarded, and the hopelessly ill, and the psychotic, and those debilitated by extreme old age, which, well, hopefully, will live long enough to experience it. Because you're older than me. Just discovered Martin was 1 year older than me. It's a great relation. And also, a person sunk in profound dementia. You know, this is this huge category of people. They still have basic human dignity in this sense. So, my summative conclusion of this section is that although it's the distinctive characteristics of personhood that I've already mentioned that in the first instance make dignity manifest, the respect owed to this dignity, this basic dignity, extends even to those without the capacity to, for example, exercise moral reason, or to act with considered self-guidance, or even to think under certain circumstances. So this is a dignity that has to be understood to inhere in every manifestation of a living human in his or her physical presence. And that's a presence that always, as human, represents all the potentialities of reason, freedom, responsibility, and self-determination. That notion of representation is very important. So this is a value, a worth, that is given with the fact of every human existence itself. And so it's not removable by any accident of birth, misfortune, impairment, human design, under any circumstances. Now, emphasizing the givenness in this sense of inherent human dignity brings me to my main point, which is explaining why its affirmation implies a transcendent source of that dignity. And this explanation leads also to, importantly, to an examination of the fact that certain existential prerequisites, psychological, personal prerequisites, have to be fulfilled if a person is going to arrive for themselves at an explicit, accurate apprehension and authentic embrace of this transcendent basis. It's not something that's obvious, it's not something that just happens. And this is where Patočka's thought is going to come in. The core argument here is this. If dignity is given along with human existence, then it belongs to human beings, essentially. Part of their essence. And for something to belong to human beings, essentially, by definition, it must be something beyond all human differences of particularity. The givenness of dignity presupposes, in other words, a human nature, and human nature is something that's been very strongly into criticism in contemporary philosophy. A human nature that transcends all differences of biology, locality, culture, and history. But for there to be an essential and unchanging human nature, that nature's givenness must be grounded ontologically in a reality that is not intrinsically conditioned by the shifting particularities of space and time. Now, one common term for such a non-conditioned reality is the word transcendence, which is why I'm using it. But it's very important not to read too much content into this term, transcendence. The term transcendence, philosophically understood, is profoundly heuristic. That is to say, it's the content, the meaning content, whatever you understand when I say the word transcendence, is just barely filled in at all. It just simply means an order of reality that in some sense, not a spatial sense, obviously, but in some sense lies beyond the ever-shifting particularities of the world. It doesn't refer to a place. That's a spatial idea. It doesn't refer to an imaginable entity. That is a spatio-temporal idea. So transcendence is perhaps best thought of as maybe a dimension of meaning, or a realm of meaning, that grounds and mysteriously encompasses the meanings, all the meanings that we are concerned with in our everyday, shifting, human, particular lives. Now, that same issue can be clarified another way. For there to be a given human nature that are defined by qualities that are not contingent but essential, then that nature must be grounded in a reality that itself is not contingent, but the opposite of contingent, which is absolute. And this is where we come into Havel's language of the experience of the absolute. This is not merely Havel's language, but a continual thing, of course, for 2,000 years, 2,500 years of philosophy. Only the presumption of the ontological rootedness of personhood in an absolute, unchanging reality allows us, logically, rationally, philosophically, to grant basic inherent human dignity the status of an absolute truth. A truth that, by absolute meaning, a truth that admits of no exceptions and no perishability, and that will apply to every human being who is going to be born and has ever been born. And to embrace that truth as a permanent basis, a permanent foundation for universal and inalienable human rights. So the language of absolute reality and the language of transcendent reality refers to the same fact, that elemental or basic human dignity is imparted to the human being by a non-contingent source or ground of all existence, which is why that dignity lies beyond the possibility of any revocation by human beings of any kind. Otherwise, you could not make the argument. So both Havel and Patočka affirm this to be the case. Havel explained how his concern, in the speech of 1995 that I just mentioned, Havel explained how his concern to understand just why it can be stated unequivocally that human beings do have rights led him to recognize what he called the prime origin of such rights as lying in, and Martin has already read this quotation, the dimensions of the infinite, of eternity. Patočka describes in his heretical essays the very core of reality in which such human truths are grounded as the mystery of an unperishing and unperishable component of the whole of the cosmos. It's the same language as absolutes and transcendent. So both Havel and Patočka recognize the necessarily transcendent, which, to use another language, the necessarily spiritual, in the broad heuristic sense of the word spiritual, roots of human existence, human dignity, and human rights. Then I'm going to summarize a little bit more of what I do in my paper. I want to explain that for both Havel and Patočka, when they refer to something like absolute reality, it's a word that Patočka uses. He also uses the word transcendence occasionally. They are not simply referring to a concept that's understood, but to an experience that's undergone. Havel, for example, when he refers explicitly to the general human experience of the absolute, he doesn't mean our ability to grasp the concept or use the concept of the non-finite or the eternity or something like that. He means experience. Experience. So then I attempt briefly in the paper, too briefly, to explicate that these, what I consider to be two basic modes of this experience of the absolute. First, I experience in my consciousness my own freedom, which, to be truly freedom, by definition, is not causally originating, but in a sense is non-conditioned. It's certainly conditioned in the sense that it's my freedom living in my concrete physical existence, but it's non-conditioned in the sense that it is truly freedom. And I also, along with that, I experience, as part of my consciousness, what can be called a sense of the unconditioned, which is what allows us to use rather freely such concepts as the infinite and the eternal and the absolute and the and non-conditionality and so forth, and have an understanding of their meaning. both of these, both this sense of the unconditioned on the one hand and my experience of my freedom on the other, derive from my experience of participation in an unconditioned reality. This is partly what Havel was getting at. But there's another context, which is very important. Through the interpersonal experiences of my freedom encountering your freedom, the freedom of others, I experience an unconditional, absolute sense of responsibility to the infinite value of the other. This has already been touched upon by both of you in responding to the suffering of others, the injustice that's suffered by others. And this sense of an absolute responsibility, or a non-finite, an unconditional responsibility that I experience when my freedom encounters truly the freedom of you, of another person, that may not be adverted to. That the depth of that responsibility is often not paid attention to. But yet, it is an experience. We have many experiences that we don't understand the meaning of clearly. As T.S. Eliot put it in the poem, we had the experience but missed the meaning. Happens all the time. So, if such reflections are valid, then why isn't the human experience of the absolute that Havel talks about, or the experience of transcendence, universally acknowledged, or more universally acknowledged than it is, especially in our contemporary world, where it's been attacked relentlessly by many postmodern philosophers and many others? There are many ways to approach an answer to the question as to why it is not more universally acknowledged. Thinking only of just 20th century philosophers, Martin Buber's approach comes to mind, that of Gabriel Marcel comes to mind, that of Emmanuel Levinas comes to mind, that of Eric Vogelin comes to mind. They're all valuable approaches to answering this question. But what I want to do is focus on Jan Patočka's insights as to why this is the case. And in his heretical essays, in the philosophy of history, Patočka illuminates the issue first by explaining how human beings initially came to an explicit recognition of the transcendence of the ground of human existence and reality in the first two chapters of the heretical essays. And then by showing why that explicit recognition remains a perpetual difficulty and a perpetual challenge, especially in our own era. So, then I'm going to go into a little Patočka analysis. Patočka explains that certain existential dispositions and certain existential commitments are required for human beings to arrive at the explicit discovery of transcendence on the basis of the experiences that I mentioned above. And through that discovery to recognize that they are spiritual beings who, in his words, are related to an unperishing and unperishable ground of reality. And so to get at what those existential conditions and prerequisites are, we have to begin, following his analysis, by understanding that everyday human life takes refuge in the comfort of embracing human life in the world as essentially, as he puts it, non-problematic. That doesn't mean we don't have practical problems. It means that in the necessary and ordinary routines of human activities, we understand ourselves to be involved in elemental meanings that are given, already pre-given, and that we know for certain. Now, to genuinely bring into question the givenness and the certainties of these meanings is to make the very why and wherefore of the cosmos as a whole and the purpose of human existence in the world problematic, as he puts it. And we can see both historically, on the one hand, and existentially, on the other, that this radical bringing into question of the givenness givenness and certainty of the meanings that everyday life lives its life by occurs through human freedom discovering itself to be a possibility for the creation of future, non-given unsecured, as yet unrealized meanings and ways of being and living in the world. Patočka connects this with the emergence of the public space of classical Greek philosophy in Athens and other things. Now, that means that it's through the profound questioning of pre-given certainties and pre-given attitudes and the inevitable loss of meaning and the risk of that loss of meaning that this entails. What happens is that the free human soul is, as Patočka puts it, is set free of the ordinary, that's his phrase, and discovers that the essence of the human existence is what he calls in one passage, the spirit of free meaning bestowal. That's an extraordinary historical transition that you could follow in the text. It's also a difficult existential challenge in any time. And that, finally, is only accomplished psychologically and existentially through what he calls a shaking of life with all of its certainties. A shaking that, among other crucial disruptions, eliminates all pre-given answers and certainties about what the ground of the cosmos is, about what the ground of the universe is. So, the gods of myth, the gods of cosmological existence, also the god of later religions. If, from a religious perspective, from a later non-religious perspective, whatever one might think one has a fairly certain or clear grasp on, but the ultimate foundation of the universe has to be put into question, or this does not happen. So in this process, a posture of radical questioning, and this is Socrates, of course, dissolves all of the known and all of the knowable aspects, or answers, I should say, about the sacred ground of the cosmos, and discloses it, in Patočka's words, to be an eternal mystery, or a beyond, or a transcendence, to which the shaken soul must always remain in a position of perpetual question. And he says that only in such a shaken but undaunted posture of questioning openness, with regard to the ultimate source of our own freedom, can a person explicitly come to recognize the ground of the cosmos to be what he calls an abyss and a mystery of transcendent meaning. So you see how drained of content the term transcendence becomes through that phenomenological analysis. From the time of the ancient Greek philosophers through the Christian era into our contemporary dispensation, it's obviously not everyone, as Patočka's analysis makes clear, who is able or willing to sustain the perpetual uncertainties and the permanent openness to ultimate mysteries of meaning involved in such a shaking. And so it can't be expected that what Havel describes as the general experience of the absolute is going to produce in a majority of people, much less universally, a clear, reflective grasp of the fact that concepts such as the unconditioned, the infinite, the eternal, derive from genuine experiences of transcendence that testify to an absolutely unconditioned reality from which we derive and in which we essentially, by human nature, participate. Patočka's analysis, his phenomenological analysis of the existential difficulties involved in affirming transcendence, addresses other related factors with difficult depth and astuteness. Especially, he is aware, as is every competent philosopher who addresses the issue of experiences of transcendence, that the human understanding and articulation of those experiences entails the conscious acceptance of a very unsettling core of human ignorance and linguistic incapacity. For in understanding that we experience participation in transcendent meaning, we also understand that that meaning is a mystery to us. And as as the philosopher Eric Vogelin puts it, we understand transcendence to lie, that it incomprehensibly lies beyond all that we experience of it in participation, and can be spoken of only by characterizing it as reaching beyond all symbolic language. In other words, as soon as we affirm the reality of the absolute, like Havel did, we also affirm it to lie beyond anything that we can substantively understand of it, and anything that we can directly say of it. So we affirm that we know that we participate in a ground of reality of which we can never provide proof or evidence, and that we are speaking of a reality whose content cannot be adequately represented in speech. This is what Patočka means in writing this, when he writes that the shaking of certainties that reveals the ground of being to be an abyss of transcendence is, in his words, the uncovering of a meaning that can never be explained as a thing, which cannot be mastered, delimited, grasped positively, and dominated, but which is present only in the seeking of being. Only in the seeking. That is, absolute reality can only be brought into clarity. The mystery can only be brought into the clarity of illumination, and its recognition sustained by continually seeking it with questions that remain questions, that don't end up as answers. In the shaken recognition that while it is real, it is nevertheless an eternal mystery beyond all the indirect expression. I hope it's becoming clearer why this is not appealing to many people. I hope that my paper is, but I hope that the issue. Also, Patočka makes clear this point. We have to note that the relinquishing of what might be called cognitive and existential mastery, and thus that relinquishing is a kind of humility. It's also a kind of humility entailed in recognizing our participation in an absolute reality, irradiates and alters our understanding of our relationships with other persons. For now, once we come to this conscious recognition, we recognize the other, the person, as a person who, despite her embodied finiteness and the contingency of her existence, is explicitly transparent as a manifestation of the freedom and value of a transcendent reality, and therefore as a carrier and a possessor of an infinite absolute value, the incalculable value, to use Kant's phrase, the incalculable value that is articulated in the principle of inherent dignity. A value beyond price, a value beyond exchange value, an incalculable value. Now, the conscious recognition of the infinite value of persons invests us with the knowledge that our responsibility towards them is also unconditioned and infinite. Because it is not, to use Patočka's phrase, it's not vested in a humanly comprehensible essence of goodness anymore, but rather in an inscrutable relationship to the absolute highest being. And through each person, or to use Martin Buber's language, in every I-thou relation, that is a fundamental dimension of the experience. But we also know that we can never live up to such an infinite responsibility, that we never have. On the contrary, we know we have always already failed to do so. We've always already fallen short in our primal obligation to will the good and to love unconditionally those whom we have encountered and those whom we will encounter. And so I can only knowingly embrace my infinite responsibility to all other persons as incarnations of absolute value by simultaneously embracing my consciousness of my guilt in having failed to live up to my infinite responsibility. Now that, as Patočka notes, this is Christianity, this is called the universality of sin. That's the Christian language for it. But the irony here is that a fully conscious and sustained respect for inherent human dignity, which is the respect called for in human rights documents, is rooted in a perpetual awareness of one's failure to fully respect that dignity. If you don't have that experience of the failure to respect, then you're not committed to the recognition of that respect. So from the foregoing, I think it's clear that, as Patočka eloquently puts it, only those engaged in the constant shaking of assured meanings and certainties with respect to the cosmos and personal existence will find themselves ready to affirm with conviction and commitment that there is an absolute reality that validates inherent human dignity and inalienable rights as absolute truths, non-perishable truths. And so these people, such people, have to be able to tolerate psychologically the reality, the fact that the ground of reality is an eternal mystery which can never be known or named with certainty, that the inevitable misuse of one's freedom with regard to others leaves one's ultimate moral and spiritual status always uncertain, and that to truly embrace history and historical consciousness means recognizing that human freedom, insofar as it grasps its own essence as a possibility for the creation of new kinds of meaning and modes of self-determination, renders the future of history uncertain and unknowable. So these three basic uncertainties that have to be able to be tolerated. And those people who are capable of holding on to the truth of those uncertainties about history, about one's own moral and spiritual status, about the ground of the universe and human existence, those who are able to hold on to that, Patočka writes, are bound together in a unity, what he calls a unity of the shaken but undaunted. And it's precisely from this solidarity, this unity or solidarity of the shaken, as he calls it, that will emerge the insights and the commitments necessary for effective protection of the principle of inherent human dignity through a shared witness to the absolute ground of dignity and rights. If you can't bear honest, clear-eyed commitment to the absolute ground of dignity and rights, you can't ultimately defend them philosophically. And you have to be open to that shaking and the tolerance of those uncertainties to be open to that. So this leads to, this is my last basic point, this critical and diagnostic insight, I think, of the first importance. If genuine ongoing revelation of the absolute truth of dignity and rights requires openness both to the eternal mysteriousness of the ground of reality and to the existential and historical uncertainties I just described, then that truth is going to be eclipsed or undermined whenever human beings presume or claim that they have cognitive certitude about the ground and nature of the cosmos, or about the moral and spiritual status of themselves or others, or about the future course and outcome of history. And you'll find many, many people who offer those claims, those presumptions and those claims about the future of history, about one's moral and spiritual status, and about knowing what the ground of the cosmos finally is, are legion. And they're legion both in religious culture and in secular culture. We hear them from, on the one hand, in religion from religious fundamentalists and literalists who presume to be in possession, as we know, of definitive answers concerning God, divine human relations, and the historical future, and especially to be capable of confident judgment regarding the spiritual standing of individuals and groups. Again, claims of cognitive certitude that there is no absolute or transcendent reality. And you hear those claims too. And confidence in the eventual human mastery of history. This is basic to the views of many, many philosophical materialists and immanentists and political thinkers and educators and you name it. Likewise, it informs the scientific and usually technocratic viewpoint that all reality in principle is understandable in humanly rational terms, and that there are no existential or metaphysical mysteries inaccessible to eventual scientific explanation. This is a core tenet of the Enlightenment project. So, it's important, I think, to state emphatically that if it is the continual embrace of ultimate uncertainties by those who belong to the solidarity of the shaken that protects human dignity and rights through continual revelation of the mysterious absolute that grounds them, then the claim that certain and final answers about reality are known or knowable automatically destabilizes and weakens respect for human dignity and rights by implicitly eclipsing the truth, or explicitly eclipsing the truth of their transcendent basis or ground. So this is the final key connection I want to make. As soon as somebody claims that they know with certitude that there's no transcendence, that there's no absolute reality, that they know the outcome of history, or that they know what God thinks and they know about what your spiritual status is, they are undermining human rights and human dignity by those claims. So now it might come as a surprise to many eminentist progressivists and to adherents of scientific optimism and to religious persons who don't experience any uncertainty in their spiritual lives that their outlooks are inimical to protecting and upholding the principles of inherent human dignity and inalienable human rights. But it was certainly no cause of surprise or self-doubt to the leaders of the Soviet Union and the governments of the Soviet bloc that their materialist ideology guiding their policies implied a rejection of those principles, a rejection continually manifested in institutionalized contempt for the observance and protection of basic freedoms and citizens. So my final comment, my final sentence, is that in line with Patočka's insights and using his evocative formulation, it is only from the solidarity of the shaping that the spiritual authority will continually emerge, that can with philosophical consistency and some scope of political persuasiveness say no to oppressive regimes and institutions whose policies violate inherent human dignity and the rights that flow from inherent dignity.
I have one quick question. Why have you not used in your speech, and maybe I'm wrong, the word soul? Because for Patočka,
care of the soul,
discovery of soul, history of soul, care of the soul seems to be one of the key elements. You didn't need, for whatever reason, this concept in your speech. I think soul is exactly this strange thing that is not existent, but it potentially is a space for everything. It has a batu logo. Deep logos, and that's why you cannot reach its peirada.
It's limits.
Why haven't you used the word soul?
I used the word consciousness rather than soul in the sense of the theories of consciousness of Eric Vogel and other people like that. But I'm happy to replace all of the uses of consciousness with the word soul because soul carries the connotations that you imply more than consciousness, which is more helpful. And it would have made my presentation longer, my paper longer, to go into the notion that the soul, the human consciousness or soul, it has the boundaries that you cannot find, the limitlessness that you cannot find no matter how deep you go, because it is the place where the temporal and the spatial and the worldly is intersected by or intermingled with or intermixed with the dimension of transcendent meaning, which is not intrinsically conditioned by space and time. It's what Vogel calls the metaxy, the in-between, and Plato as well. Yeah.
Okay, so special welcome to Paul Wilson, who is just arrived. Hi Paul, we had a good journey. And now the field is open for
well, thank you for this very serious and very persuasive paper. I do not agree with everything, but I will actually present a kind of alternative view of Patočka and of the, let's say, the attitude to the absolute in the next paper. So I will not touch on this, but I would like to ask you this kind of smaller points, but maybe not too small. Namely, whether we would say that there is a certain discrepancy or at least a kind of important difference between Havel's attitude and Patočka's attitude, and whether we would say that that's at least how I understood what you were saying, that this experience, this kind of direct experience with an absolute that Havel speaks about, would be subject to this sweeping distancing and questioning and epoche, if you wish, within this more Socratic project of Patočka. Would you see this kind of difference between the two?
I have to preface my response by saying that I have read very, very, very little of Havel's writings, a few speeches and a couple of passages. So I can't address the difference in terms of any depth at all. But at the same time, I want to mention that in Patočka's Socratic sort of endless seeking that he articulates, he does go out of his way in a couple of places in the heretical essays to point out that it is crucial that we remember that the soul belongs to the cosmos, not the cosmos to the soul, that we are an emergence within being. And that reminder, to me, echoes the idea that as an emergence within being, in which we, yes, have a relationship to an unperishable whole, as a participant in being, since the basis of that whole is an unperishable component of the whole, we must be participants in it. I think that's inevitable. So that I don't think in the last analysis Patočka would say, oh, I reject that language of experience. But especially because there was a section of my paper where I went into, which I cut out, which was about the need for consciousness always to remember, or the soul always to remember, that it doesn't have or confront being, but it emerges from within and is given within and is constituted by the whole within which we have it. That's very important. I probably Havel would be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
Professor Susan.
Yes, thank you for a masterful lecture. I have to stop and think, as Martin says. So I'll probably have better questions tomorrow, but I'll give it a try now. We've discussed some of these things before, so in a way I'm repeating something that you and I have discussed before. But I'd like to hear what you think now and share it with the others. If you look at the history of theology, the way you are describing the heuristic of transcendence, the concept of transcendence, reminds one of what is often called the apophatic theology of Greek theology of the 4th century, where you had thinkers such as Gregory of Nyssa emphasizing that in the end, the true speech about God must be silent, because all of our words will always be limited. So our understanding of God, even through the Word of God in the Bible, is limited. When we think of what God is, even the word "is" will be limited. Thomas Aquinas later writes about that. It's an analogy of the sort. Anyway, the thing, of course, that the theologians had recourse to and insisted on the importance of would be a cataphatic theology to actually aid human beings as they try to live their lives. And that's where the stories of Jesus become important, for instance, or, rituals.
Yeah.
So they will not be truth in themselves, but they will be pointers to truth. Exactly. My question to you would be, where is the cataphatic theology, to use that term, the confirming theology of human rights? Is it in the present human rights documents we have? Or can it also be, and usefully complemented by, human experiences and actions of, say, religion? Because provocatively you say that anyone who believes, I'm paraphrasing ironically, anything for certain comes in the way of human rights. And on the other hand, could one not say that it's exactly through belonging to a tradition, taking part in a ritual, understanding something that's grounded in a time and a place and writings, that we actually fully can comprehend?
Yes.
At least most people.
Yes.
Because for many, the heuristic and the seeking and the linguistic incapacity and the abyss will not be much to build on.
Yes. Yes.
So, where do we find those things, the handrails we can activate?
I was going to add one more of the same.
Please, because it's such a small question.
Aristotle somewhere makes a very simple distinction between proteron, katauto, and proteron, protemas.
Yes.
The first
first
and is first for. So I think that this is something. What is it about?
It is. Yeah, I'll start with Martin's response, and then I'll get to my own. Yes. First, that which is first for us, that which we need, that which we use to approach, is cataphatic, positive, content-laden images, symbols, pointers, examples, incarnate meanings of all kinds. You know, whether it's Krishna, or whether it's Jesus, or whether it's Muhammad, or whether it's Buddha. Well, Muhammad's a little different. But anyway, you get the idea. And the stories, the parables, the myths, the exemplary things, these are crucial. That which is first in itself, as opposed to that which is first for us, obviously is what we're talking about when we talk about the apophatic tradition and talk about the ultimate mystery of transcendence. One of the crucial advantages of these human rights documents in their non-contextualized presentation of human dignity is that every religious tradition can find its correlate in there. And also, when I was engaged in, it's certainly not the only way you can go about filling in the content of the idea of human dignity, but the way I did so in terms of those basic, that's cataphatic.
Yeah.
That's sort of filling that in, but it's not definitive. So I think there's 2 points I want to make. One is we are creatures of the in-between. We have to have evocative, evoking and affect-laden images and symbols and examples and descriptions in order to proceed in our imaginative, moral, spiritual, and political lives. We have to have them. On the other hand, the moment we take those as as descriptive images rather than heuristic images, and then step into the claim that we now know God and God's mind, or whatever it might be, in the same manner that we can define what a cat is or what voltage is, we're in trouble. So there has to be a blend of the apophatic and the cataphatic. With respect to the issue of human rights and human dignity, I think it's very helpful to take the notions of apophatic and cataphatic theology as applied to the understanding of the divine, and the grounding in both mystical experience and positive responses to content-filled images and symbols and parables and myths and so forth, and apply it to anthropology. I think we need to understand that we have both a cataphatic and an apophatic anthropology, and I think Patočka's understanding of what it means to be human in the experience of shakenness opens up for us a recognition that although we can cataphatically give some definite content to the meaning of inherent dignity and distinctive human qualities, characteristics, and worth, that's cataphatic. On the other hand, the openness of human freedom for the creation of free meaning bestowal and the securing of as yet unknown ways of being in the world means that we have to have an open-ended, apophatic grasp of what it means to be a human being. And apophatic anthropology is, let's say, in its infancy. But there are philosophers like Patočka who are in line with it, I think. Yes, Ilona.
I must say that I am a layperson amongst all of you very serious philosophical students and experts and professors. And what I'd like to say is that, so I come to this in not the same intellectual journey as all of you. And so I find myself, first of all, having this wonderful experience of intellectual exercise. So, and my mind is very active. My intellect, that part of my brain is very active. But what resonates with what you said, Chip, is that my experience and my sense of my soul and my experience of the infinite and the transcendental nature of reality and whatever you want to call it is completely a non-intellectual thing. And of course, that's the problem, as I hear you speaking. And for me, I just want to say, just as a statement, why I perceive or understand myself to be here is to bring that abyss, experience of the abyss, in some useful way into this level of reality where we are all struggling to move forward and to support and expand the inherent human dignity of all people. So I want to thank you for that. Was really great because it really brought it all for me as a non-literate person in you guys' world into the real understanding.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Lavona. That's a wonderful comment. And much to talk about in that.
I would add one more Arendtian point.
Yes.
Obviously, Arendt is known by her strong philosophical interpretation of natality. Each human being for her is new beginning. And actually, when she quotes from St. Augustine, she means that through each human being, initio is brought back to the world. It's a kind of this creatio continua hypothesis. And it seems to me that you mentioned this concept of uniqueness of each human being.
Yeah.
And I think that uniqueness is that each human being introduces a new beginning to the world. Maybe this is the hidden principle of the world's history.
Yes.
Each newborn person is a new hope.
Yes.
We are equal in one certain element only, that each of us is different from everybody else. So I think that this Arendtian concept fits very much into the whole structure.
I think that's exactly right. I think to really meditate on the true radical uniqueness, one-of-a-kindness, irreplaceability of every human being leads you into a profound vision of what history is, but also it gives us an alternative to the totalitarian vision of
superfluity.
Yes,
Individuals are superfluous that you need to get rid of them.
Yes, and also people are in a totalitarian vision. People are replaceable.
Yeah.
By definition, they're replaceable. It doesn't matter whether this person does this task or that task. It doesn't matter.
Go on.
There could be many questions. It was very interesting, remarkable, and I agree with your main point. And I have two questions. The first one, I should start with the profound agreement with your point that if we take human rights seriously, they must be based in an objective absolute dignity. And if we take absolute objective dignity seriously, then it must be based in transcendence and not in a contingent phenomena of time, space, and matter. I agree with that completely. However, I just observed that the history of Western philosophy has moved from that, let's say, Aristotelian, realistic view that there is an objective reality and that we human persons, with our intellects and reasons, can know and understand that reality. For example, that we know that there is an objective dignity based in transcendence. So the development of Western philosophy from nominalism through empirism, skepticism, positivism, to modern and postmodern era completely philosophically undermines the very reasons for believing there is an objective human dignity. Do you agree with me, or am I wrong somewhere in this point? That modern Western philosopher who just denies realistic metaphysical certainty has no reason to accept the claim of an objective human being. That's the first point. And second point, I again agree with you that, let's say, scientists or positivists on the one hand, and on the other hand, fundamentalists who claim that they know the whole of spiritual certainty, that are undermining the concept of human dignity. However, on the other hand, would you make the same claim concerning epistemological certainty and uncertainty? It seems to me that if we deny epistemological certainty concerning, for example, the fact that human dignity is objective and absolute, that if we accept epistemological uncertainty, then we are undermining the concept of objective human dignity as well.
There's three questions, so far at least, in what you have to say. I'll make very quick comments. They may not be satisfying to you, but I think each of them requires longer discussion because the issues, especially the epistemological issues, are quite complicated. With respect to objectivity, with respect to the undermining of objectivity in the development of philosophy in modernity, there is the problem. You're familiar with the criticism within starting in the early 20th century of so-called onto-theology. You know that language. Okay, this is a big part of the problem has to do with the understanding of the meaning of the word object and therefore the meaning of the word objectivity. Now, it's not just a semantic issue because object has been almost consistently, invariably thought of, except by mystical philosophers, in terms of some kind of hypostatic or entified reality. And one of the insights that has been moving forward in recent centuries in contemporary philosophy, which is not wrong-headed, in my view, although it has led into many misinterpretive dead ends, is a critique of that notion of object and objectivity. The end result should not be to throw out the baby with the bathwater, to throw out the fact that there is an absolute that grounds the absolute truths of dignity and rights, but rather to critique the idea that what it means to say that and to be confident in one's judgment that there is such a reality is the affirmation that there is something object-like. Okay, so that's one thing. And this leads into epistemological issues. Because epistemology ultimately is the interpretation, the definition of what we can know and how we can, and what knowing is. And unless you engage in a very careful epistemological critique in which you show very clearly that the way we come to know ends up defining what an object is in a way that is quite different and rather heuristic compared to what a typical empiricist or his enemy, a typical postmodernist, would assume. Until you do that, you haven't gotten to the core of the problem. Now, there are interpreters of philosophy of knowledge, epistemologists, cognitive theorists, who I think are doing that job. One of them is Bernard Lonergan. Not many people know him, not many people have read of him, but he's it's quite an advance on Kant, let's say. Another question you raised having to do with religious groups. The idea that, and I may not be directly answering your question here, but this is at least what sparked in my mind. Many people of many religious commitments would disagree vehemently with the idea that their commitment to their faith is undermining respect for dignity and rights. The reason that I make the provocative statement that if they claim a certain kind of cognitive status with respect to the objects of their faith or to the concerns of their faith, that they are doing that, is that it is an implicit claim that you know that there are other persons who do not stand in an appropriate relationship with the divine. And as soon as you make that claim, you are on the slope to being ready to say, these people do not deserve these rights, I think.
So, Eugene?
Okay. Thank you very much. I tremendously enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
And while I was listening to it, it came to my mind that perhaps society is always relative and humanity is absolute.
Yeah.
Because society cannot be absolute. Because if you treat society as an absolute, then we are in trouble. And my first question was about objectivism and objective human dignity. Because for me, human dignity always bears existential meaning rather than objective meaning. You can't objectify. And when I was listening to your 5 elements of human dignity, of course it was driven by this ethical, theological language. Reason, freedom, responsibility, uniqueness of every human person, vulnerability. And I was immediately thinking of anthropological truisms as precondition for every system of positive law. You say reason, and you said reason. So why don't you say communication? You say freedom, and we can say, and sociologists can say action. You say responsibility, and you can say solidarity. And you say uniqueness, you say individuality. And finally vulnerability. So there are these anthropological truisms which actually no legal system of any, no legal system can ignore.
That's right.
And so my question then is, to what extent, if you want to make a law legitimate, you have to engage in this philosophical or theological argument? Do you, in other words, do you need political theology to make politics, positive systems of politics and law legitimate? Or can you get away with it?
I think as with the little that I know about the world of legal application, of especially the attempts to enforce principles of dignity and rights legally and jurisprudentially in the last 60 or 70 years, I think that I have two minor answers to your question, because I can't give you a really good answer. One is that these concepts of non-content given dignity and rights have been given to judges and to lawyers and put into courts because of the introduction of these terms centrally to articles in constitutions and state protections in a way that has made judges crazy, especially in Canada. There was a recent, I'm sure you know, there was a number of recent statements on the part of significant judicial figures, judges in the Canadian system, saying this bringing of dignity, the concept of dignity, into trial situations, litigation, where people are thinking that it's going to help to clarify the offenses against them. We have discovered that it has muddied the waters, and we are not going to, and we're going to back off from from putting weight on this concept of dignity, because nobody is giving us an appropriate content for this. Now, who could provide such an appropriate content within the legal context? The difficulty, you're caught in a double bind here, because if you're going to have it work legally, you have to have that non-contextualized version of it. Otherwise, it's not going to work transculturally, and it's not going to work in terms of international law. So you can't bring in philosophers and political theologians to give the content, because then it's going to be too culture-specific and it's going to be too nation-specific. I think the biggest problem, as I understand it, in this legal philosophical divide with respect to the importance of the concept of dignity as is increasingly used in the world that we live in, is this. I think wherever in constitutions and in legal documents the concept of dignity has been interpreted as a right rather than as a quality or state belonging to the person, an ontological state that is the foundation of rights. But wherever it's been interpreted as a right, and people bring lawsuits saying, my dignity has been offended, and I have a right to not have this person offend my dignity, you're in trouble. This is a basic misunderstanding here, I think. This is the thing that your question most makes me think of.
I think let's do it for now, for time.
Okay.
A round of applause for Chip. Again, invite for coffees or whatever in the garden, and in 10-15 minutes we'll be back.